morning of April 12, 1945, the B-29 city of Los Angeles punched through a sky torn apart by flak from Japanese coastal batteries. A flash, and the world went blindingly white. A malfunctioning phosphorus flare cooked off, flooding the aircraft with toxic smoke and sending it into a steep, uncontrolled dive toward the Pacific. Blind, fighting a deck that was dropping out from under him, Staff Sergeant Henry Erwin picked up an object hot enough to liquefy steel. He moved forward through the smoke, feeling his way along 12 feet of bucking fuselage from memory alone, until his left forearm slammed into the navigator's table. Dead end. I've been carrying this story with me, and now I'm passing it to you. The emotions are real. The moments are powerful. Subscribe. Make yourself comfortable, and let's experience this together. The story of that flight began in the recruiting offices of Alabama. They called him Red on account of his hair, and the name suited him in the easy way nicknames do when they're given without malice. He was not a large man, not a loud one. He had joined the Army Reserve out of Bessemer in the summer of '42, the way most young men from that part of Alabama had, because the mills were slow. The future was uncertain, and something vast and terrible had happened to the country and demanded an answer. He had wanted to fly. He had sat through the evaluations at the cadet program with the concentrated seriousness of a man who understood that wanting a thing very badly was not always enough, and in the end, the instructors had written "flying deficiency" in his file and pointed him toward the radio school at Keesler Field in Mississippi. He had accepted this with no visible bitterness. He had not stopped wanting to serve. He had simply found a different way to do it. By the spring of '45, Staff Sergeant Henry Erwin had completed 10 combat missions over the Japanese home islands aboard a Boeing B-29 Superfortress named City of Los Angeles, under the command of Captain George Cimarral. The Superfortress was the largest bomber the Army Air Forces had ever put in the sky. 100 tons of American engineering riding on 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each one producing more horsepower than anything a boy from Adamsville could reasonably picture. The crew numbered 12 men. Erwin's station was amidships, where he operated the radio equipment and, when called upon, served as a gunner. He knew every man on that plane by his breathing. General LeMay's 20th Air Force had shifted tactics earlier that year, bringing the big planes down from their high-altitude precision runs to lower, harder passes over Japanese industrial targets. The losses were real, the results decisive. From February through early April, Erwin's group had flown unescorted into the heart of Japan, and he had earned 2 air medals in the process. The missions had a sameness to them that was deceptive. The same pre-dawn briefings, the same roar of engines on the coral runway at Guam, the same smell of hydraulic fluid and fear that no amount of familiarity could fully domesticate. On the evening of April 11th, the crew was briefed on their 11th mission. The target was a chemical manufacturing complex at Koriyama, 120 miles north of Tokyo in the mountains of Honshu. It was a legitimate military objective, the kind of plant that fed the war's industrial appetite, and it would be defended. Erwin listened to the briefing with his hands resting flat on his thighs, the way he always listened to things that mattered. He had an additional duty on this mission beyond his radio work. At a designated assembly point off the Japanese coast, he would drop white phosphorus smoke bombs through a floor chute to mark the formation's rally point. It was not complicated work. He had done similar things before, and the routine of it was almost reassuring. That night, before lights out, several men on the crew saw him sitting apart with his Bible open across his knees. No one interrupted him. There was a quality to his stillness that discouraged interruption. Not coldness, but something more like completeness. He was, as he had always been, in conversation with something larger than the mission. The pre-mission darkness on Guam had its own particular quality. Not the soft dark of civilian sleep, but something harder, more deliberate, lit at the edges by the blue-white glow of the flight line where ground crews had been working through the night. By 0300 on the morning of April 12th, the crew of City of Los Angeles had eaten their powdered eggs in the mess hall with the concentrated silence of men who had learned that conversation before a mission spent something you might need later. Erwin drank his coffee black and did not finish it. The aircraft itself had been loaded and checked again. She sat heavy on the hard stand, fuel and ordnance having added a gravitas to her bulk that made her seem more earthbound than a thing designed to fly had any right to look. A ground crewman was still wiping condensation from the gun positions when the crew walked out in the early dark, their flight gear making them thick and anonymous. Captain Cimarol walked the length of her without speaking, touching the fuselage once near the nose with the flat of his hand, a habit his crew had stopped remarking on. Erwin's particular cargo for this mission had been explained in the briefing and explained again. A case of AN-M8 smoke canisters, white phosphorus, each one about the size of a fat thermos. His job was to drop them through the floor chute when the formation reached its designated assembly point off the southern coast of Honshu. The lead plane would signal. He would pull the pin, seat the canister in the chute, release it. The burning phosphorus would billow white against the water far below, and the following aircraft would know where to rally. Straightforward work. The kind of additional duty that filled the margins of every mission with a dozen small competencies that had to be performed correctly while everything else was also happening. What the briefing did not dwell on, because briefings rarely dwelt on the things that went wrong, was the behavior of white phosphorus when it did not behave. The substance ignited on contact with air at temperatures that made steel run soft. It could not be smothered. It could not be reasoned with. The canisters were safe as long as they were sealed. Everyone understood this to be true, and no one said it aloud. Over the interphone, as City of Los Angeles rolled toward the runway in the dark, someone, Erwin thought it was the bombardier, made a remark about the weather over Honshu. Somebody else told him to pipe down. The engines ran up through their frequencies one by one, each one finding its register in Erwin's chest. And then the brakes released, and the runway lights began to stream past the windows, and the heavy plane lifted herself, reluctantly it always seemed to him, into the Pacific night. He checked his radio equipment. He checked the chute. He settled into his position and felt the familiar vibration of the airframe working its way up through the seat and into his spine. And he thought, briefly and without drama, of the scripture he had read the night before. I called on the Lord to help me. Then the coastline fell away beneath them, and there was only the dark water and the sound of the engines and 11 other men breathing in the dark, all of them moving north. The Japanese coast appeared as a darker darkness against the pre-dawn sea, a low, ragged line that the navigator called out without inflection, and almost immediately the ack-ack began. It came up in clusters, dirty brown-black blooms appearing at their altitude with a regularity that suggested calculation, each burst trailing a fraction of a second of sound that reached the airframe as a muffled concussion felt more in the chest than heard by the ears. The 75mm batteries below were tracking the formation with the practiced efficiency of crews who had been doing this every day for months. City of Los Angeles shuddered as a burst walked itself close along the port side, and Cimarol made a small correction without comment, his hands on the yoke with the steadiness of a man adjusting to weather. Erwin heard the interphone crackle with terse position calls. A Japanese fighter, someone identified it as a Frank, one of the new Nakajima interceptors, had been spotted climbing through the formation's altitude off the starboard bow. The gunners acknowledged and tracked, and the fighter peeled away without pressing his attack, either discouraged or setting up for another run. There was no way to know which. There was rarely a way to know which. They were over the assembly point. The signal came from the lead aircraft. Erwin pulled the first canister from the case. It was cold from the altitude, heavier than it looked, the metal smooth under his gloved hands. He seated it in the floor chute, felt it engage, pulled his glove back to expose his right hand for the pin, standard procedure. He had rehearsed the sequence enough times that his hands moved without requiring instruction from the rest of him. He pulled the pin and guided the canister into the chute and released it. It did not fall. He registered this fact in the half-second before everything changed. The canister had caught somewhere in the chute's mouth, and then the phosphorus found its air, and the world became white. The explosion was not a sound so much as a pressure, a flat, violent thump that he felt in his teeth and behind his eyes simultaneously. The burning material came back up the chute and into his face with the indifference of physics, not malice, simply the consequence of a malfunctioning fuse and the nature of white phosphorus. It ignites at contact with oxygen, and it does not stop. The heat registered as something beyond pain, beyond the vocabulary his nervous system had developed for ordinary injury. His vision went, not gradually. Between one fraction of a second and the next, sight became a uniform white, and then nothing. He knew what was happening. Some part of him, functioning with a clarity that had nothing to do with what was occurring to his body, understood the situation with complete precision. The canister was burning in the aircraft. White phosphorus burns at temperatures that compromise structural metal. Below him, separated by the thickness of the aircraft floor, was the bomb bay. If the burning material reached it, no one on the plane would require any further concern about Japanese fighters or the ack-ack batteries below. The smoke hit the cockpit before Cimarron could do anything about it. P-205, dense and white and immediately toxic, rolled forward through the pressurized tunnel and swallowed the instrument panel whole. Cimarron lost his horizon. He lost his altimeter. He felt the nose drop and applied back pressure on the yoke and could not tell without the instruments whether he was correcting or compounding the problem. The plane began to descend. Erwin could not see any of this. He could hear it, the changed note of the engines as the nose fell, the shouting on the interphone that cut through even the ringing in his ears. He could feel the deck tilting under him. He understood the tilt. He picked up the canister. The phosphorus burning against his bare hand communicated itself to whatever receptors still functioned as a sensation that had no analog in his prior experience of pain. White and total, and strangely clarifying, in the way that extremes sometimes clarify. He could not put the canister down. He could not set it anywhere in the aircraft. The only acceptable destination was outside the aircraft, and outside meant the cockpit windows, and the cockpit was forward, and he could not see. He began to move. The interphone was still live. He could hear Cimarron working through the dive. He could hear the engines. He put his left hand out and found the curve of the gun turret housing and used it to orient himself, cataloging what he knew about the geometry of this aircraft the way a man checks his pockets for something he cannot afford to have lost. 12 feet, perhaps, from where he stood to the cockpit. One obstacle he knew about, the navigator's chart table, hinged to the forward bulkhead, which would be down and locked because the navigator had been at his sighting position when the signal came. The deck was still tilting. Through the soles of his boots, he could feel the vibration of 4 Wright cyclones pulling 3,500 horsepower each, and the vibration was no longer level. The plane was in a dive. The water was somewhere below them and getting closer. He moved forward through the white smoke and the white pain, one hand on the turret housing, the other pressed against his ribs with the burning canister between them, and he did not stop. The navigator's table was down. He found it with his left forearm rather than his hand, a flat, unyielding surface across the passageway at chest height, exactly where he had known it would be, and exactly as impassable as he had feared. The navigator had gone forward to make his sighting and had left the table locked in the open position, horizontal, blocking the only path between Erwin and the cockpit windows. Under ordinary circumstances, a man released the table by working both latches simultaneously with both hands, folding it back against the bulkhead in one motion. The procedure required perhaps 4 seconds and the use of both hands. He had one hand. The other held the canister against his ribs. The phosphorus had been burning for approximately 15 seconds. In those 15 seconds, it had worked through his flight jacket, through his shirt, and into his right forearm and his rib cage, with the methodical patience of a chemical process that did not distinguish between one material and the next. He could feel it, in the way a man feels something that is moved beyond pain into a register for which pain is an inadequate word. A continuous, deep heat that was no longer located on the surface of his body, but had moved somewhere deeper, past any register he had for it. The phosphorus did not require oxygen from outside. It carried enough with it to continue. He could not put the canister down. There was nowhere in the aircraft to put it that would not be worse than where it was. He wedged himself against the bulkhead and got his left hand on one of the table latches and pulled. The latch held. He pulled again with the full weight of his shoulder behind it and felt the latch give but not release. Bent, perhaps, or the table warped slightly in its frame from the temperature differentials of high-altitude flight. The deck was tilting more steeply under his feet now. Without his vision, he was navigating entirely by the geometry of the aircraft in his memory and the pressure of the floor against his boots. And the floor was telling him the nose was still down, still falling. In the cockpit, Cimarral had lost 300 feet in the smoke before he found partial reference through the co-pilot's side window, a gray suggestion of horizon, and began working the yoke against the dive with the careful inputs of a man who understood that overcorrecting a heavy aircraft at low altitude produced its own category of catastrophe. The instruments remained invisible in the smoke. He was flying by the window and by feel. He called for altitude on the interphone and got no useful answer. The crew in the rear compartments knew only that the plane was descending and that something was burning forward of their positions. Erwin got the table up. He could not have said afterward precisely how he accomplished it, whether he had gotten both latches with one hand in sequence or whether the table had simply given way under the force he applied with his shoulder and the dead weight of his arm. It went up, and he went through the opening it left and came into the cockpit passage, still holding the canister against his ribs, the phosphorus now visible to Cimarral and the co-pilot as a source of light in the white smoke. A burning thing carried by a burning man. Cimarral saw him. He said nothing that was ever recorded. What the aircraft was doing occupied everything. The altimeter, briefly visible as the smoke thinned in a fractional draft from a seal somewhere in the cockpit, showed them below 1,000 feet and descending. The Pacific was below them, the actual physical Pacific, gray and enormous and close, and the B-29 weighed, at this point in the mission with fuel burned and ordnance remaining, somewhere near 50 tons. At 300 feet above water, a 50-ton aircraft in a dive becomes a navigational problem with a single solution and very little time in which to apply it. Erwin found the co-pilot's window by feel. His left hand touched the frame, moved to the release, and he understood that he was going to have to transfer the canister or maneuver around it and his body, operating now almost independently of whatever cognitive process was still running behind his burned features, made the necessary adjustments. The canister moved. His hand found the latch. Outside, 300 feet below and closing, the sea waited with perfect indifference. He had perhaps 2 seconds. The canister cleared the window. Erwin did not see it go. He felt the weight leave his body, or rather, he felt the specific quality of what had been pressing against his ribs cease to press, and he understood from this that the thing was no longer in the aircraft. Then his legs stopped working and he went down between the pilot seats in the way that heavy things go down when the structure holding them up has spent everything it had. Cimarral had the window. With the burning source gone and the smoke beginning to thin in the draft of the opened frame, he found his horizon, a real one. Gray Pacific morning light, the actual line between water and sky, and he put the yoke back with both hands and held it there. The B-29 protested in every frame and spar, the enormous tail coming around, the engines roaring at the demand being made of them. 300 feet above the water, the nose came through level. Then it came up. The altimeter, visible now in the clearing smoke, confirmed what Cimarral could feel through the seat. They were climbing. He held the climb for several seconds before he trusted it enough to speak. Around Erwin, the crew moved. The navigator and the co-pilot got to him first, and what they found required a moment before either of them acted. Not from unwillingness, but from the processing time that the human mind requires when confronted with damage of that magnitude. His flight jacket was still smoldering in places. His face had sustained burns severe enough that the men who reached him needed a moment before either of them could act. They extinguished what was burning with their hands and with the small fire extinguisher mounted aft of the co-pilot's seat, working quickly and carefully. And when they uncovered a section of his arms to assess the burns, the phosphorus still caught air and resumed burning, and they covered them again. He was conscious. This was the fact that organized everything else that followed. The medical kit, the morphine, the interphone call from Cimarron to the formation stating their status and their intention. Erwin was conscious, and he was breathing, and when one of the crew leaned close and told him they were all right, all 12 of them, the aircraft was all right, Cimarron had it, the words reached him through whatever remained of his hearing and produced a response that the man who received it did not forget for the rest of his life. Erwin did not ask about himself. He asked, with a clarity that had no business existing in a man who had endured what he had endured, whether the crew was safe. He was told that they were. Cimarron set course for Iwo Jima, due south, roughly 600 miles. The island had been in American hands since late March, and its airfields, carved out of volcanic rock by Seabees working around the clock, existed precisely for moments like this one. More than a few B-29s had already found their way there on one engine or none, trailing smoke, carrying their wounded. The standing arrangement was understood throughout the 20th Air Force. Iwo was the place you went when you needed somewhere to go. The formation continued north toward Koriyama without them. In the cockpit, Cimarron trimmed the aircraft for the long flight south and ran through his instrument checks with the methodical thoroughness of a man restoring order. The smoke had cleared enough to read every gauge. All 4 engines were running clean. The aircraft was structurally sound. The floor chute had sustained damage, but the floor itself had held. The bomb bay below it intact. Whatever had been required of City of Los Angeles in the last 3 minutes, she had provided. Behind him, his crew kept Erwin as still as they could manage and kept the wounds covered and told him at intervals what he asked to know. The interphone carried Cimarron's voice, steady and unhurried, calling their heading and altitude as though it were any other leg of any other mission. The Pacific spread out below them, enormous and gray and indifferent. The same water it had always been. They brought City of Los Angeles down on Iwo Jima in the late morning, and the medical personnel who came out to meet her were not prepared for what they found, though they were men who had seen a great deal by that point in the war. Erwin was removed from the aircraft on a stretcher and taken to the field hospital, where the attending surgeon made his assessment with the careful neutrality of a man recording facts into a log. The burns covered the majority of his face, both arms, and the right side of his torso. The burns extended across his face and had affected his hearing, his nose, and the tissue around both eyes. The prognosis that the surgeon relayed to the Army Air Force's medical command was not a prognosis so much as an expectation that Staff Sergeant Henry Erwin would not survive the night. The island's volcanic rock held the day's heat long after the sun had moved, and the ward was warm, and the man on the cot breathed with the shallow determination of someone who had not yet been informed of the expectation. The crew of City of Los Angeles remained on Iwo Jima through the afternoon. Cimarron filed his report. The other men sat where they could find a sit and said very little. There was not much to say that the silence did not already contain. They had come through 11 missions together, and they understood by now the particular arithmetic of what had happened. The 12 men were alive and accounted for because one of them had decided in the space of a few seconds to pick up a burning object and carry it through the length of the aircraft while blind. The arithmetic was simple. The fact of it was not. Word moved through channels with unusual speed. By the time it reached Major General Curtis LeMay's headquarters on Guam, the recommendation for the Medal of Honor had already been drafted by officers who understood the situation and understood the surgeon's expectation and understood that these two facts together required a particular urgency. LeMay approved it within hours. Brigadier General Loris Norstad signed off in turn. A medal was put on an aircraft and flown from Hawaii to Guam, and a general went to a hospital ward and pinned it to the sheet above a man whose arms could not be raised to receive it. Erwin was conscious for the presentation. Whether he fully understood what was happening in those hours remained, afterward, a matter of some gentleness among the men who had been present. What was certain was that he had understood enough in the first hours on the island before the fever climbed to ask again about his crew. He had been told again that they were safe. He had not asked about himself. He did not die that night, nor the night after, nor the 30 months of nights that followed in the burn and reconstructive wards at Valley Forge General Hospital in Pennsylvania, where surgeons performed 41 operations and restored, in the end, his sight and the partial use of one arm. The work was slow and painful in the way that the repair of serious damage is always slow and painful, without drama, without the clarity of crisis. Simply the long, daily discipline of a man who had, apparently, decided to remain. He went home to Alabama. He went to work at the Veterans Hospital in Birmingham, where for 37 years he sat across desks from men who had come back from various wars, carrying various damages, and he helped them navigate the forms and the bureaucracy and the particular loneliness of trying to explain to a civilian institution what had happened to you and what you needed now. He was patient at this work. He was good at it. He did not speak about April 12, 1945, unless someone asked, and sometimes not even then. The coal smoke was long gone from Birmingham by the time he retired. The furnaces cold, the landscape changed into something he only partially recognized. He had lived, in the end, considerably longer than anyone on Iwo Jima had estimated. He died at his home on a January morning in 2002 and was buried in the red Alabama earth he had grown up in, and the sky above the cemetery was the same pale winter sky it had always been, indifferent and clear and very far away.